In the autumn of 1864, as the American Civil War ground through its bloodiest year and cast its shadow across a nation torn by conflict, the city of Philadelphia maintained its position as one of the country's most prosperous and culturally sophisticated urban centers. Along Chestnut Street, between the grand facades of banking houses and the elegant storefronts of established merchants, stood a particular class of business that had emerged to serve a very specific and somber need of Victorian society. These were the photographic studios, and among them, the practice of post-mortem photography had become not merely accepted, but expected, a final tribute to the departed that families of means considered as essential as the funeral service itself. The daguerreotype, that miraculous process by which light could be captured and fixed upon a silvered copper plate, had transformed the way Americans preserved memory, and nowhere was this more profound than in the documentation of death. In an era when mortality claimed infants with ruthless regularity, when childhood diseases swept through neighborhoods, and when the war delivered death telegrams to households across the land with devastating frequency, the post-mortem photograph served as the only visual record many families would ever possess of their lost loved ones. The practice was conducted with dignity and professional precision, the photographers who specialized in this work understanding that they provided an invaluable service to the grieving, a tangible connection to those who had passed beyond the veil. Emmett Blackwood operated one of Philadelphia's most respected photographic establishments at No. 47 Chestnut Street, a three-story building whose ground-floor studio featured the large north-facing windows, essential for the carefully controlled natural light required by the daguerreotype process. Blackwood himself was 42 years old in 1864, a man whose reputation for technical excellence and compassionate professionalism had made his studio the preferred choice for Philadelphia's bereaved families. His memorial photographs were known for their clarity, their dignified composition, and the peaceful repose he somehow managed to capture in his subjects, arranging the deceased with such care that they appeared merely to be sleeping, soon to wake. The studio itself reflected the solemnity of its purpose, draped in heavy velvet curtains the color of burgundy wine, its walls adorned with examples of Blackwood's work in ornate frames, its air perpetually tinged with the chemical scents of mercury, vapor, and iodine that were the signatures of the daguerreotype process. In the back rooms, away from where families waited, Blackwood maintained his darkroom and processing area, that alchemical space where silver-plated copper underwent its transformation, where images emerged from chemical baths like ghosts materializing from fog. It was here, in this intersection of science and sentiment, of chemistry and commemoration, that something would occur which would challenge everything Emmett Blackwood understood about his craft, about death itself, and about the nature of what might persist beyond it. But before we dive into this nightmare, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now, let's begin. On the morning of the 23rd of October 1864, as autumn rain drummed against the large studio windows and cast the interior of Blackwood's establishment in that particular grey light that photographers both appreciated and cursed in equal measure, the Whitmore family arrived bearing their burden of grief and their deceased daughter. Eleanor Whitmore had been 24 years old when death claimed her 3 days prior, and according to the family physician's certificate that her father presented to Blackwood, the cause had been listed as consumption, though the rapidity of her decline had apparently surprised even the attending doctor. The young woman's body had been prepared by the mortician with exceptional care, her dark auburn hair arranged in elaborate curls that framed a face of such ethereal beauty that Blackwood, despite his years of experience photographing the dead, found himself momentarily arrested by the sight of her. She appeared not as one ravaged by disease, but rather as though she had simply drifted into the deepest of sleeps, her pale skin possessing an almost luminous quality, her features composed in an expression of such profound serenity that it seemed to transcend the usual peaceful masks of death. The family had dressed her in a gown of white silk, and around her throat she wore a delicate locket on a silver chain, a detail that her mother, red-eyed and trembling, insisted must be visible in the photograph. Blackwood conducted the initial consultation with his customary professionalism, explaining the process, the exposure time required, the number of plates he would prepare, speaking in the soft, measured tones he had perfected for such occasions. What struck him as peculiar, however, was the family's insistence on multiple exposures, far more than was typical for a memorial portrait. The father, Marcus Whitmore, a prominent lawyer whose grief manifested as a kind of rigid, controlled intensity, requested no fewer than 6 separate daguerreotypes, claiming that the family wished to ensure they captured Eleanor exactly as she was, that they needed multiple images for different family members, explanations that seemed reasonable enough on the surface, yet carried an undercurrent of something Blackwood could not quite identify. The studio atmosphere itself seemed charged that morning in a way that defied easy explanation, the air feeling heavier than the weather alone could account for, and twice during the positioning of Eleanor's body on the velvet-draped settee that served as his primary staging furniture, Blackwood experienced the peculiar sensation of being watched, of some presence in the studio, beyond the grieving family members who stood in respectful silence along the western wall. He attributed these feelings to the general melancholy of the occasion, to the particularly tragic youth of the deceased, and to his own fatigue from a week of unusually demanding commissions. As he prepared the first plate with meticulous care, coating the polished silver surface with light-sensitive chemicals, as he positioned his camera and calculated the exposure time based on the available light, Blackwood had no inkling that he was about to document something that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. The development process for a daguerreotype was an intricate ballet of chemistry and timing, one that Blackwood had performed thousands of times with unwavering precision, and so it was with complete confidence in his methodology that he retired to his darkroom after the first 2 exposures had been completed. The exposed plates required immediate processing, the latent image made visible through exposure to mercury vapor heated over a spirit lamp, the silver amalgam forming in those areas where light had struck the sensitized surface, creating the characteristic mirror-like image for which daguerreotypes were prized. Blackwood worked in the amber glow of his safety lamp, watching as the first plate began to reveal its captured scene, the familiar emergence of form from formlessness that never failed to produce in him a sense of witnessing something miraculous. What materialized on that silvered surface, however, caused his hands to freeze mid-motion above the mercury bath. Eleanor Whitmore's image had formed with perfect clarity, her white gown luminous against the dark velvet backdrop, every detail of her arranged hair and the delicate locket at her throat rendered with exquisite sharpness. But her eyes, which Blackwood knew with absolute certainty had been closed during the exposure, which he had personally verified were closed before he uncapped the lens, stared directly at the camera with unmistakable clarity. Not the partially opened lids that might result from post-mortem relaxation of facial muscles, not the mere suggestion of an opening, but fully opened eyes that gazed with what appeared to be conscious awareness toward the lens. Blackwood's first response was to question his own memory, to assume that in the solemnity of the moment he had simply failed to notice that Eleanor's eyes had been open, that grief and atmosphere had clouded his normally meticulous observation. He set the first plate aside with trembling hands and proceeded to develop the second exposure, certain that it would show the closed-eyed repose he remembered. The second plate emerged from the mercury vapor with the same impossible result. Eleanor's eyes were open, and what was more disturbing, they appeared identical to the first image, suggesting not random post-mortem movement, but a consistent state that had somehow evaded his direct observation, yet been captured by the unblinking honesty of the photographic process. Blackwood examined both plates under his brightest lamp, searching for any technical explanation, any flaw in the coating or contamination in the chemicals that might produce such an artifact, but the images were technically perfect, showing none of the streaking, fogging, or distortion that would indicate processing errors. The scientific precision of the daguerreotype process was both its greatest strength and, in this moment, the source of Blackwood's growing unease. For unlike painted portraits which could be attributed to artistic interpretation, the photograph was understood to be an objective record of reality, an image created by light itself without the intervention of human interpretation. If the plates showed Eleanor's eyes open, then either his memory was fundamentally unreliable, or something impossible had occurred during those long exposure seconds when the camera's lens had been uncapped and light had streamed onto the sensitized silver to write its indelible truth. Blackwood emerged from his darkroom with both plates in hand, his professional composure barely concealing the turmoil beneath, and walked directly to the viewing room where Eleanor's body remained arranged on the settee, the Whitmore family having departed with assurances that the images would be ready for collection the following day. He approached the deceased young woman with clinical deliberation, setting the daguerreotypes aside and leaning close to examine her face under the grey afternoon light that filtered through the studio windows. Her eyes were closed, definitively, completely, unmistakably closed, the lids smooth and relaxed in death, showing no sign of recent movement or disturbance. Blackwood placed his fingers gently against her eyelids, feeling the coolness of her skin, the absolute stillness of death, and confirmed what his eyes had already told him with certainty. He checked for the subtle signs that might indicate post-mortem changes, the slight desiccation of tissues, the settling of fluids, all the markers of a body 3 days deceased, and found everything exactly as it should be for a corpse prepared and preserved according to standard mortuary practice. There was no rational explanation for the discrepancy between what lay before him and what the camera had captured. Blackwood made a decision that departed from his usual protocol. He would create a third exposure immediately, but this time he would document every aspect of the process with meticulous written notes, creating a record that would either reveal his error or confirm the impossible. He called for his assistant, Thomas Welch, a young man of 22 who had apprenticed under Blackwood for 3 years and whose technical competence was beyond question. Together, they prepared a fresh plate, and Blackwood insisted that Welch personally verify Eleanor's appearance before the exposure commenced. Thomas approached the body, examined it carefully, and confirmed in clear terms that the subject's eyes were closed, that she appeared exactly as a deceased person should appear. They made the exposure with Blackwood's camera positioned at the same angle as before, using identical lighting conditions and an exposure time of precisely 45 seconds, which Blackwood timed with his pocket watch, while Thomas stood as witness to the entire procedure. The development of this third plate produced a result that elevated the phenomenon from the merely impossible to the actively terrifying. Eleanor's eyes were not only open in this image, but the corners of her mouth had curved upward in what could only be described as a slight but unmistakable smile, an expression of such subtle animation that it suggested not the random movements of a corpse, but something that approached conscious emotion. Thomas Welch, examining the developed plate under Blackwood's direction, went pale and took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving instinctively to make the sign of the cross, his Catholic upbringing asserting itself in the face of something that defied natural law. It was in the conversation that followed, as the two men struggled to comprehend what they were documenting, that Thomas mentioned something the Whitmore family had told him during their arrival that morning, while Blackwood had been preparing the studio. Eleanor had been engaged to be married to a soldier, a young lieutenant named James Garrett, who had gone missing in Virginia and was presumed dead, though no official confirmation had yet arrived. The investigation into James Garrett's history revealed a narrative that was tragically common in that autumn of 1864, yet contained specific details that would soon acquire a significance far beyond the ordinary sorrows of wartime loss. Lieutenant James Garrett had served with the 71st Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment, a unit that had seen continuous action since its formation in 1861 and had been present at some of the war's most devastating engagements. Military records indicated that Garrett, 26 years old, and the son of a Philadelphia merchant, had enlisted as a private but had distinguished himself sufficiently to receive a field commission to lieutenant following the Battle of Gettysburg, where his actions during the defense of Cemetery Ridge had been noted in his commander's official report. He had met Eleanor Whitmore in the spring of 1863 during a brief furlough, and their courtship, conducted largely through correspondence as Garrett's regiment moved through the campaigns of 1863 and into the brutal warfare of 1864, had been preserved in a collection of letters that Eleanor's mother shared with Blackwood during a conversation that took place the evening after the third impossible photograph had been developed. These letters, written in Garrett's careful hand on whatever paper he could procure in camp, revealed a man of considerable education and sensitivity, someone who wrote to Eleanor of his dreams for their future together, of the home they would establish, of children they would raise far from the sounds of artillery and the screams of the wounded. The correspondence formed a paper trail of promises and devotion that made what followed all the more devastating. In September of 1864, during the siege operations around Petersburg, Virginia, Garrett's unit had been engaged in an assault on Confederate entrenchments when he had gone missing. The official designation was missing in action, that terrible military terminology that left families suspended between hope and grief, unable to mourn yet unable to celebrate, trapped in an agonizing uncertainty. The date of his disappearance was recorded in the regimental records as the 29th of September 1864, exactly 3 weeks and 4 days before Eleanor's death. What Mrs. Whitmore revealed to Blackwood, speaking in hushed tones in the studio's reception area while her daughter's body lay in the next room, was that Eleanor's decline had been both rapid and inexplicable. She had been in perfect health when the news of Garrett's disappearance arrived by military telegram on October 3rd. Within days, however, she had begun to exhibit signs of severe illness, a wasting condition that Dr. Samuel Morrison, the attending physician, had diagnosed as consumption despite the absence of the typical prolonged progression of that disease. Eleanor had taken to her bed, growing weaker with each passing day, yet through it all, she had insisted, with increasing agitation as family members dismissed her claims, that James visited her each night. She spoke of conversations they held, of his presence beside her bed, of his hand holding hers in the darkness. The family had attributed these statements to fever, delirium, to the psychological trauma of grief, manifesting as hallucination. But Eleanor had been adamant, even in her final hours, that James came to her, that he was waiting for her, that he had promised they would not be separated. She died on the 20th of October 1864, 3 weeks after receiving news of Garrett's disappearance, having wasted away with a speed that defied medical explanation, speaking his name with her final breath. Over the following days, Blackwood created additional exposures with a dedication that bordered on obsession, each photograph adding another layer to a phenomenon that defied every principle of his craft and his understanding of the natural world. The fourth daguerreotype, created on the morning of October 25th with both Thomas Welch and Marcus Whitmore present as witnesses, showed Eleanor with her eyes fully open and her smile more pronounced, an expression that conveyed not the vacant stare of death, but something that resembled genuine emotion, perhaps even joy. The fifth exposure, taken that same afternoon after Blackwood had once again personally verified that Eleanor's physical body remained unchanged in its deathly repose, revealed what appeared to be a slight turn of her head, a rotation of perhaps 2 degrees that would have been impossible to detect with the naked eye, yet was undeniable when compared directly to the previous images. Blackwood began maintaining meticulous documentation, measuring the exact position of Eleanor's body, marking the settee with chalk to ensure no physical movement could occur between exposures, even going so far as to place small weights on her hands and shoulders to prevent any possibility of natural shifting. None of these precautions had any effect on what the camera captured. Each subsequent image showed progressive changes that occurred only in the photographic record, never in the observable reality of the corpse itself. What made the situation even more disturbing were the accounts that began to emerge from the Whitmore household, testimonies that Mrs. Whitmore and Eleanor's younger sister, Clara, aged 19, shared with Blackwood in conversations marked by fear and desperate seeking of explanation. The family reported that in the days since Eleanor's death, their home had become the site of phenomena that they could no longer dismiss or rationalize. The most persistent occurrence was a sound heard in the night, the distinctive tread of boots on the floorboards of the upper hallway, always approaching Eleanor's room where her body had been laid out before being transported to Blackwood's studio. These footsteps were heavy, measured, unmistakably masculine, and they were accompanied by a presence that made the air itself feel dense and charged. Multiple family members reported sudden drops in temperature when passing Eleanor's former room, a coldness so profound it seemed to emanate from some source beyond mere absence of heat. Even more unsettling was an odor that appeared sporadically throughout the house, a combination of gunpowder and tobacco smoke that Marcus Whitmore, himself a veteran of the Mexican War, recognized immediately as the distinctive scent of military camps and battlefields. Clara Whitmore's testimony was particularly harrowing. She reported that on the night of October 24th, unable to sleep, she had approached her deceased sister's room and had seen, through the partially open door, a figure standing beside Eleanor's bed. The figure was that of a man in Union Army uniform, his back to the door, leaning over the bed in an attitude of tender attention. Clara had frozen in terror, unable to scream or move, and had watched as the figure reached down as if to touch Eleanor's face. The moment Clara had finally found her voice and cried out, the figure had vanished instantaneously, not walking away or fading gradually, but simply ceasing to exist between one moment and the next. The family had found Clara collapsed in the hallway, and when they entered Eleanor's room, they found it empty save for the body. Yet the scent of gunpowder lingered so strongly that it made their eyes water. On the 29th of October 1864, 6 days after Eleanor Whitmore's body had first arrived at his studio, Blackwood made a decision that would produce the most extraordinary and disturbing photograph of his career, an image that would stand as either evidence of something beyond death or as proof of his descent into delusion, depending on who examined it and what they were willing to believe. He had spent the previous night sleepless, reviewing his documentation, examining each daguerreotype in sequence, and wrestling with the reality that he had captured something that should not exist. That morning, he resolved to attempt one final exposure, but this time he would extend the exposure time far beyond the standard duration, allowing the sensitized plate to gather light for a full 3 minutes rather than the typical 45 seconds. His reasoning, documented in his journal, was that if some presence was manifesting during the exposures, but too subtly or briefly to be captured in shorter durations, an extended exposure might reveal more of whatever was occurring beyond the threshold of normal perception. He prepared the plate with ritual precision, positioned his camera, verified once more that Eleanor's body showed no signs of the animation captured in previous images, and uncapped the lens as the clock in his studio marked precisely 9 o'clock in the morning. The 3 minutes of exposure time felt interminable, and Blackwood would later write that the studio seemed to grow progressively colder as the seconds accumulated, that the light itself seemed to take on a quality he could not adequately describe, as though the air had become somehow thicker, more resistant to illumination. When he finally recapped the lens and retreated to his darkroom to develop the plate, his hands were trembling not from cold but from an anticipation that was indistinguishable from dread. What emerged from the mercury vapor exceeded anything he had prepared himself to witness. The plate showed Eleanor clearly, her expression one of unmistakable peace and what could only be interpreted as love, but she was no longer alone in the frame. Beside her, leaning over her body with his hand resting gently against her cheek, was the figure of a man in the uniform of a Union Army lieutenant. The figure was not transparent or ghostly in the manner of spirit photography that mediums and charlatans had been producing with double exposures and deliberate fraud. Instead, he appeared solid and present, captured with the same photographic clarity as Eleanor herself. Yet there was something in the quality of the image that marked him as fundamentally different from living subjects Blackwood had photographed. The soldier's uniform was that of the infantry, and it was damaged, torn across the chest in a pattern that suggested massive trauma. His face, young and handsome, bore an expression of infinite tenderness as he gazed down at Eleanor, but it also showed signs of violence, a darkness around the temple that might have been blood or shadow. Most disturbing of all was the soldier's hand where it touched Eleanor's face, for the photograph showed, with daguerreotype precision, that while the hand appeared to make contact, there was a quality to the light around it that suggested it was not entirely solid, not entirely of the material world, yet not merely a photographic artifact or error. Blackwood stood in his darkroom, staring at the plate for nearly an hour, holding it under different angles of light, searching desperately for any technical explanation for what he had captured, and finding none that his professional expertise would allow him to accept. The confirmation arrived on the 2nd of November 1864 in the form of official military correspondence delivered to the Whitmore residence, and Marcus Whitmore brought the documents directly to Blackwood's studio with hands that shook so violently he could barely hold the papers steady enough to read. The War Department communication, bearing the official seals and signatures that marked it as authentic military record, confirmed that First Lieutenant James Garrett of the 71st Pennsylvania Infantry had been killed in action during an assault on Confederate positions near Petersburg, Virginia. The date of death was recorded with bureaucratic precision as the 29th of September 1864, at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The letter included details that had been compiled from witness statements by by surviving members of Garrett's unit, men who had seen him fall and who had been forced to retreat without recovering his body from the contested ground where he had died. According to these accounts, Lieutenant Garrett had been leading his men forward when he had been struck by multiple rifle rounds, at least one of which had hit him in the chest with sufficient force to kill him almost instantly, and another that had struck his head, specifically the left temple region. His body had remained on the battlefield for 2 days before a temporary truce had allowed for the recovery of the dead, and he had been buried in a military cemetery near Petersburg with full honors due his rank. What made this confirmation devastating in its implications was the timeline it established with incontrovertible clarity. James Garrett had died on the 29th of September 1864, 3 full weeks before Eleanor received the telegram informing her family that he was missing in action. He had been dead for 21 days when Eleanor began her rapid decline, dead for nearly 4 weeks when she died on October 20th, and dead for exactly 30 days when Blackwood created the final photograph showing a uniformed soldier standing beside Eleanor's body. The description of Garrett's wounds, documented in the military casualty report with the clinical precision that characterized such records, matched with horrifying accuracy the damage visible on the figure captured in Blackwood's daguerreotype, the torn uniform across the chest, and the darkness around the left temple that could now be identified with certainty as the mark of a bullet's impact. Marcus Whitmore had brought with him a photograph of James Garrett taken before his deployment, a standard carte de visite portrait that showed a young man in fresh uniform, smiling confidently at the camera, very much alive. When this image was placed beside the daguerreotype that showed the figure standing over Eleanor's body, the identification was absolute and undeniable. The face was identical, allowing for the changes that violent death and whatever existence followed might impose upon features once animated by life. Even more significant was a detail that the family had not known to mention previously because they had not known of its existence. Garrett wore on his right hand, clearly visible in both the carte de visite and in Blackwood's impossible daguerreotype, a distinctive ring bearing his family crest, a detail too specific to be coincidental, too precise to be explained by imagination or suggestion. The inescapable conclusion, the truth that now confronted everyone who examined the evidence with honest scrutiny, was that Eleanor Whitmore had not been delusional or fevered when she insisted that James visited her in those final weeks. Something, some essence or remnant or impossibility that bore James Garrett's appearance and his wounds and his devotion had indeed been coming to her, and that presence had remained with her even beyond her own death, faithful to whatever promise had been made between them. Eleanor Whitmore was laid to rest on the 4th of November 1864 in Laurel Hill Cemetery, overlooking the Schuylkill River, her funeral attended by family, friends, and a community that had no knowledge of the extraordinary phenomena that had surrounded her death and the days that followed. The service was conducted with proper Victorian solemnity, and Eleanor was interred in the Whitmore family plot, with James Garrett's name inscribed beside hers on the monument, a gesture that acknowledged the engagement that death had prevented from reaching its earthly conclusion. What was most significant about Eleanor's burial, documented carefully in Blackwood's journal, was what ceased to occur the moment her coffin was lowered into the earth. The phenomena that had plagued the Whitmore household stopped entirely and immediately, as though some circuit had been broken, some connection severed. The footsteps in the hallway were never heard again. The cold spots dissipated. The scent of gunpowder and tobacco vanished from the rooms where it had lingered. Even more telling, when Blackwood attempted to photograph Eleanor's gravesite several days after the interment, hoping perhaps to capture some residual presence, the resulting daguerreotype showed only stone and earth and the November trees, nothing more. Whatever had been visiting Eleanor, whatever presence had manifested with such persistence and had been captured with such impossible clarity on Blackwood's plates, and had departed when she was finally at rest in the ground. For Emmett Blackwood, however, the end of the phenomena marked not a conclusion, but the beginning of a personal crisis that would define the remainder of his professional life. He had in his possession a series of daguerreotypes that documented something that should not exist, physical evidence created through a scientific process that was understood to be objective and truthful, showing progressive changes in a deceased subject and culminating in the clear image of a figure that had been dead for weeks appearing beside the woman he had loved. Blackwood's first instinct was to share this evidence with the scientific and photographic communities, to present his documentation to the Philadelphia Photographic Society, and to submit his findings for serious academic examination. He prepared a detailed presentation in December of 1864, complete with the daguerreotypes themselves, his meticulous notes documenting the conditions under which each exposure had been made, witness testimonies from Thomas Welch and members of the Whitmore family, and the military records confirming James Garrett's death and the details of his wounds. The response to his presentation was swift and devastating. Members of the Photographic Society dismissed his evidence as either deliberate fraud or the result of technical incompetence, suggesting that he had somehow created double exposures despite the daguerreotype process, making such manipulations extraordinarily difficult to execute convincingly. His reputation, built over years of respected professional work, began to crumble as word spread through Philadelphia's photographic community that Emmett Blackwood had either become a charlatan, attempting to capitalize on the public's fascination with spiritualism, or had suffered some form of mental breakdown that rendered his work unreliable. Clients who had previously sought his services for memorial photography began patronizing other studios, concerned that their deceased loved ones might become subjects of similar sensationalist claims. The daguerreotypes themselves became objects of controversy and fear, and Blackwood ultimately made the decision to seal them in a protective case and place them in a bank vault, along with all his documentation and journals related to the case, where they would remain untouched and hidden for decades. In the years that followed, Blackwood continued to operate his studio, though never again with the prominence he had once enjoyed, and he pursued an obsessive private quest to capture similar phenomena, photographing hundreds of deceased subjects in the hope of documenting another instance of post-mortem manifestation, searching always for evidence that what he had witnessed with Eleanor Whitmore was not unique, not impossible, but rather a glimpse into truths about death and persistence that the living world was not yet ready to acknowledge. Emmett Blackwood died in 1891 at the age of 69, having never publicly spoken again about the Eleanor Whitmore case after the disastrous reception of his 1864 presentation, though his private journals reveal that he never stopped thinking about those October days when his camera had captured something that defied every rational explanation. His documentation remained sealed in the bank vault where he had placed it, marked with instructions that it should not be opened until 30 years after his death, a stipulation that suggested he hoped future generations might prove more receptive to evidence that his contemporaries had rejected. When the sealed case was finally opened in 1923 by Blackwood's grandson, who had inherited the contents of the vault, it contained not only the original daguerreotypes of Eleanor Whitmore and the figure identified as James Garrett, but also hundreds of pages of journals, correspondence, technical notes, and testimonies that Blackwood had continued to compile for decades. The daguerreotypes themselves, preserved in their protective case, had survived the intervening years with remarkable clarity. The images as sharp and detailed as the day they were created, showing with undeniable precision the progression of impossible changes and culminating in that final, extraordinary double portrait. The grandson, Thomas Blackwood, attempted to donate the collection to the Library of Congress and to various academic institutions, believing that the documentation represented an important historical record, regardless of how one interpreted the phenomena it described, but found that even in the 1,920 seconds, an era fascinated by spiritualism and psychical research, mainstream institutions were reluctant to accept materials that suggested genuine photographic evidence of post-mortem manifestation. The daguerreotypes and Blackwood's documentation eventually entered private collections, and their current location remains unknown, though references to them appear in various archives and in the correspondence of early 20th century researchers into paranormal phenomena. What makes the Eleanor Whitmore case particularly significant in the history of alleged supernatural documentation is the nature of the evidence itself. Unlike the spirit photography that flourished in the Victorian era, which was almost universally exposed as fraudulent double exposures and darkroom manipulations, Blackwood's daguerreotypes were created using a process that was extraordinarily difficult to falsify convincingly, particularly in the creation of progressive changes across multiple plates. The technical characteristics of the daguerreotype, its unique one-of-a-kind nature and the precision required in its creation, made it a poor medium for deliberate deception, and multiple photographic experts who examined Blackwood's plates in the decades following 1864 found no evidence of technical manipulation, even as they struggled to offer alternative explanations for what the images depicted. The case has parallels in other instances of allegedly genuine post-mortem photography from the Civil War era, a period when the unprecedented scale of death and the relatively new technology of photography intersected in ways that produced a substantial body of unsettling images and accounts. Several other photographers documented similar anomalies in memorial portraits created during the 1860 seconds, though none with the extensive documentation and witness corroboration that characterized Blackwood's work. The question that haunts the Eleanor Whitmore case, the mystery that remains unresolved more than a century and a half after those October days in 1864, is not whether Emmett Blackwood created fraudulent images, for the evidence suggests strongly that he did not, but rather what his camera actually captured during those exposures. Was it genuine evidence of James Garrett's continued presence beyond death, a soldier's devotion so absolute that it persisted across the boundary that separates the living from the dead? Was it some form of psychic impression, Eleanor's own dying consciousness somehow affecting the photographic medium in ways that science has yet to understand? Or was it something else entirely, some phenomenon at the intersection of light and chemistry and human emotion that the daguerreotype process, in its unique sensitivity, was able to record before that technology passed into obsolescence? The daguerreotypes themselves, wherever they may now reside, remain as testimony to something that occurred in that Philadelphia studio, something that 7 daguerreotype plates documented with clinical precision, something that suggests love might indeed transcend the barrier of death, not merely as metaphor or comfort, but as physical, documentable reality captured in silver and light.